she comes. Yeah, I'll be up top.
Thank you. You take good pictures.
Well, given the sun.
This is Carol Bailey. It's
Oh,
his
yeah.
daughter.
She's been a great help.
Thank you.
She just told me. Let me see what lines I've got to say. I'm tired of this reading. Take a break.
Where would you like to pick the winners? Why don't you pick the first one?
Yeah. Take out old timers.
Right. You're gonna announce the winner. And we'll know
All right, I'm going to call this disorderly meeting to order. The first order of business is the raffle. Did you all get a chance to buy a ticket, those that wanted to buy a ticket? If so, the last three numbers, 785. 785. Ah, no fair, no fair. Okay, Jim, all right. Your choice. The next one is 798. Last three, 798. Yes, sir. Winner in the front. Lady in the balcony. The third number is 792. 792. Last three. And we have another winner. All right, the last book and the last number is 789. 789. Is that person going home? 789. Pick another one, all right? This will change up the luck. 801. New set of numbers. Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Okay. That's too much excitement. My goodness. Welcome to this evening's program. One of our members, Lisa, has passed around this urgent announcement. I recommend that you take a look at it and decide if you want to attend the public workshop tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. There's also another workshop at 8:30 a.m. on Friday. So one or both or all, I urge you to participate. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but you should show up and say, we want to be heard, whatever you want to say. We think this is important. We, the Historic Society, thinks it's important because it changes the historic nature of downtown Venice, we think. The proposed land development regulations change much of what we think is important in Venice. So familiarize yourself with what the issues are, speak if you'd like, and give your support to your fellow citizens of Venice that want to protect and preserve historic Venice. We put something in the newsletter. Is the newsletter out yet? I don't think our newsletter is out yet. Is it, Betty? No. There'll be something shortly. It will be a copy of a letter that I delivered to the City Council last week. They ignored it, but I delivered it anyway. So just because you get a chance to be heard doesn't mean you get a chance to get what you want. So we've said what we want. We'll see if that gives us what we need. Well, we're privileged tonight to have a historic legend, Venice historic legend. She's been involved in Venice history for years and years. Even though she was born and educated in Michigan, she came to Venice in 1983. That makes her almost a native. Dorothy served one term on the Venice City Council and gave that up, and several years on the city's historical commission. Dorothy was director of the historical resources for the city of Venice from 1996 until she retired in 2007. So she had the job that Harry Klinkhammer now has. And so her most important achievement, I believe, is the fact that she succeeded in 2010 in listing the John Nolen Plan Historic District in the National Register. That's the one that we all talk about. Dorothy was instrumental in putting that plan together, and that's a lot of work. It took her years, and she will talk about that, I think. And she was instrumental in that. And in fact, that's the reason we have the historic register, the plan on the historic register. She's also edited 3 volumes titled Venice Before 1925. That's something that most of us don't know much about. But she has reprints of the newspaper columns of the newspaper in Sarasota from George Heigl. You know the Heigl House. Well, that's the Heigl. He wrote under the pen name of Nemo, and he wrote a lot of columns. How many columns were there? Hundreds? Yeah, there's hundreds of columns, and it talks about life in Sarasota at that time between 1920 and 1925. So she edited those for your reading and entertainment. So I would like to introduce you to you and ask you to welcome Dorothy Korwek.
Well, thank everyone for coming out on a rather warm June evening. I'm not going to be giving my presentation up here, mainly because I'm kind of tired and it's easier to sit down and use the computer pointer to highlight things on the presentation. And after the presentation, I will be happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And I guess now we can turn down the rest of the lights so that it's a little bit easier to see the screens. I should point out that this isn't the first time I've given this presentation, and I'm really pleased that there's so many people showed up this evening. The first slide is obviously of John Nolen, and it took over 10 years to get the John Nolen Plan of Venice listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was a rather long time. My husband and I actually went to Cornell University, which has his business or planning papers. He has all of them. It's an extensive collection, and many of the plans that he did, the then Triangle Inn Association, now Venice Heritage, had digitally reproduced and are available at the Venice Archives and Area Historical Collection. I should point out that most of those images do not appear in tonight's presentation. I should point out that the plan that was listed consists of only 6 subdivisions that were platted in 1926. And before we get into it, I should point out that John Nolen's plan for Venice was not the first plan that was done for the city of Venice. And before any of these plans that we'll discuss very briefly were implemented or attempted to be implemented, there was virtually nobody here. There was a handful of residents or settlers, the Heigl family being a prominent one. Most of the people lived north of Roberts Bay in what we now call Nokomis. So we'll move on. In 1915, the Sarasota Venice Company, consisting of principals Bertha Honore Palmer, her brother Adrian Honore, and Joseph Lord, recorded this plat for the town at the terminus of the railroad tracks south of Roberts Bay in what is now the present city of Venice. It's fairly easy to, oops. I thought I got that one. Basically, you see the railroad tracks and the Y, and this was in existence for quite some time. And I think I'm going to need new glasses because I'm having trouble reading some of these screens. Okay. Recent research suggests that this plat was done to show that the Palmers were serious about developing the property they owned south of Roberts Bay. Mrs. Palmer had convinced the Seaboard Airline Railroad to extend the tracks from Fruitville Junction to what is now the city of Venice to facilitate the development of her extensive holdings that included both resort and agricultural plans. In 1918, Mrs. Palmer convinced the Post Office Department in Washington to move the Venice Post Office to this location south of Roberts Bay. This forced the settlers north of Roberts Bay to select a new name for their community. In 1917, the name Nokomis was selected. The original post office was established. The original Venice post office was established in 1888 by Darwin Curry. And until 1918, it served families both north and south of Roberts Bay. Okay, when we were putting this together, Gary thought that I kind of messed up when I made this slide because there's a big blank spot in it. Well, it's blank because we've never been able to locate the plan that Charles Levitt did for Bertha Honore Palmer. We have checked in Sarasota, and we've had people check at his home location in New England, and we were told basically that all of his plans were destroyed in a fire in a barn, which is, you know, fires happen all the time. And let's see, is there anything else? Basically, I don't know if you can read it, basically George Heigl, who wrote all the columns for the Sarasota paper about what was happening in Venice, wrote this in 1921. We are reliably informed that the Palmer interests will begin next week to buy out and survey the town of Venice with a view to placing business and residential lots on the market. The initial steps will be opening up and grading of several streets to the Gulf. Over the years, I have found that there's only one road, or at least a ghost of a road, that was probably done during this time period. And it got superseded by. This is a particularly interesting drawing. This was done by John Nolen for Dr. Fred Albee, and it included both his properties in Nokomis, Bay Point to be specific, his areas here known, forgot the name of it, and this is basically Venice, and this is a preliminary design, obviously. But what's important on this thing is the date. The date is 1924. There's some history books indicate that Dr. Albee did not purchase his land until the land that became the city of Venice until 1925. But as you can clearly see in this drawing, this line represents his property that he purchased from the Palmers and other interests in the area. So, you know, why do other history books state this? I think there was just a big mix-up. These other histories state that Albee only owned the land for 9 weeks. That really doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about everything that he did. Basically, it was November of 1924 when Nolen actually came to Venice to survey the area to come up with a plan, and this is the preliminary one that was done. So why is there such a discrepancy? I think part of the problem is that if you read abstracts, deeds, etc., they can be very confusing. The date at which something occurred can be totally different from the date in which it was actually recorded. And one has to remember that Sarasota County was not formed until 1921. And initially, until the courthouse was built, Manatee County was handling all of the property records for it. And basically by March of 1925, Albee had written Nolen to stop work on his plan. I think he saw the writing on the walls, the boom was ending, the Florida land boom was on the decline. And I think that he could probably borrow much more money. This particular drawing is one that we got from Cornell, and this was done specifically for Dr. Albee. And what you'll notice is there's a lot of different things in it. Some of it looks the same, the curved to linear streets, the downtown area, but there's this real interesting thing called Albee Green. It's a big roundabout is basically what it amounts to. Can you imagine, this is 41, coming to this and then going off in that direction? Not the best idea, but you have to remember that this plan only covered what Dr. Albee owned. And it had the prerequisite, golf course, etc. And this particular one, and a lot of the features, some of the features are still there. The names of most of the streets are much different than they are in the original Nolen plan. But I point this out because it shows the evolution. Nolen actually did this for Dr. Albee. And when Dr. Albee sold his property to the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, Albee specified that the BLE had to hire Nolen to do their plan, which is a rather remarkable statement, I have always thought. Okay, this is probably the plan that everyone is familiar with. This was done in 1926, several months after the BLE purchased the property from Dr. Albee and others. We'll go on a little bit later and show you the extent of their holdings. You see the familiar area, the green spaces for the parks, the downtown commercial area, the 9-hole golf course, which is now the public shopping center for those of you that don't know. Well, they took it over, that's the way it goes. But you see Venezia Park and these other areas. Sometimes there's a lot of features in this that obviously are very different from the Albee plan. This is 41 here, straight shot down and out in this direction. But what's important to know is the railroad tracks that used to be in this area has now been moved farther east. And Nolen actually requested that this be done because he didn't feel there was enough room between the original station, which is approximately where the red dot is, between there and the Gulf of Mexico. So he convinced the Brotherhood to have the rail lines moved to its current, well, can't say current location anymore because they tore up the railroad tracks. But basically, this is the Legacy Trail area that goes through there. Now, whoops, we're off. Remember, I had mentioned that basically that the BLE purchased a lot more property than was owned by Dr. Albee. And there is a mistake on this slide. I don't know what happened. This Jackson Road is really this here. Somewhere along the line of transferring this to various computers, stuff moved around. It happens. All of these white spaces are property that was owned by the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. These are sections. We are talking mile by mile areas. And it is estimated that the BLE acquired 27,000 acres in South Sarasota County. And this is the Myakka River here. And notice all the property they purchased east. The BLE thought big. There's absolutely no question about it. And this is Nolen plant. This basically, the area here in dark, is what became the John Nolen Plan of Venice Historic District. Most people just don't realize how much property the Brotherhood actually owned. This is one of many regional plans or sectional plans that Nolen did. What's interesting about it is not, the BLE actually wanted to connect Roberts Bay with the Myakka River. And you'll notice the canal, quite ambitious, shall we say. And this area here that's darker was the area known as Venice Farms. Most of this has never been within the city of Venice, and I think there's a number of people in the audience who live out Venice Avenue in what used to be the BLE farm area. Again, I can't emphasize enough how the BLE thought big. This particular area down here is known as Harlem Village, and this was segregated time in the U.S., and that was the area allocated for the African American workers in the area. And as you can see in red, and hopefully it shows up a little bit bigger on these screens, some of the current road names, just to give you some perspective on where it is. Okay, this is a combination of two different plans. The standard one that we saw earlier that was widely distributed, and what is known as the eastern section of it. This is the area where Edgewood is, and you see the railroad station, and this is the golf course. What's interesting about this is that, I don't know if anyone's ever noticed, you've been to the Edgewood section, there's a road over there, actually a boulevard, that's called Country Club Estates. Well, that's this road here, and basically it traversed the country club and then allowed access to a major hotels, commercial areas on the Gulf of Mexico. And a lot of this area, particularly in this section, was never officially platted, and therefore, but it was part of Nolen's plan. It seemed like every other week the BLE would request that Nolen come up with something different. And one of the things that I found most interesting, and I don't know if it shows up on this one, in this general area, Nolen had specified an area for a museum, which is a little bit unusual, I would think. Basically, what are the key features of the plan? One is that the plan incorporated various forms of transportation. The railroad, obviously, the integration of the state road system known as the Tamiami Trail with county and local roads. Nolen was very aware of what was being planned, and he came up with some suggestions on what should be done. The water access area of it, the BLE actually requested Nolen to design a deep water port. It never materialized, but basically the plan incorporated a lot of these different features. But the road system within the plan allows you to get from point A to point B in different ways. You don't have to take one road to get in and out. From where I live to get to Publix, for example, I can take Park Boulevard to different streets. I could take Harbor Drive. I could take, which I wouldn't, the Tamiami Trail because it's usually way too busy. The streets, Nolen was very specific about which streets would be boulevard, which streets would be residential, and he encouraged traffic by making streets wider. The narrower ones were reserved for more residential areas that he envisioned not having as much traffic. The curved to linear streets that are prominent in the plan are kind of unusual, but if you look at any of the plans that Nolen did in Florida, they all have those curved streets. And why did he do it? Because if you go along a curved street, you have a changing view. You're always anticipating that something new will come. And so it's a good, because Florida's flat. I mean, we got no mountains, there's nothing, pretty boring, actually, if you think about it. Okay, and what other key features? The parks and recreational facilities. Across from City Hall, there are the tennis courts, now pickleball courts, I believe, children's playground equipment, etc. This was all part of the plan. It was intentional. It wasn't left over. Every neighborhood was supposed to have a park. Nolen really wanted that no house would be more than 4 to 6 blocks from a park, because he felt that was very important for your well-being as a person. And Nolen did something that most people didn't do. He wanted the entire Gulf Beach area to be public access, and his plan clearly shows that. Unfortunately, during the boom period of the 60s and 70s, the city, in their wisdom, decided that it would increase their tax base if they built condominiums along the Gulf. And what was other important about it? The Nolen plan actually designed the zoning for the city. He specifically stated where there was to be residential areas, where the commercial was to be, where industrial, and government uses. Utilities, City Hall, etc. Why do I bring this up? Because at the time this plan was designed, nobody had zoning laws. That didn't exist at the time. So this was really quite an unusual feature of the plan, and it was done in deed restrictions, basically. And the last item is the establishment of a municipal government. And this is important because someone was able to take ownership of the streets and the parks and oversee the future development of the city. And to the cities, plus, they kept the Nolen plan, and we'll go into a little more detail on some of the subdivisions. Basically, the subdivisions that were planted in the 1920s still exist in almost exactly the same format that they did when they were initially done in the 20s. And these are the subdivisions I'm talking about. The Gulf View section, which is the largest of the areas. Never did figure out why they made it so big. Probably a lot of the documentation for it was already done because Nolen and his associates did it for Dr. Albee. And Venezia Park and Edgewood section. They kept adding on to it because I guess the Brotherhood was overly optimistic is the only way I can describe why one would have a year later hired a different engineering firm to plat new areas. And Gary is right beside me, and Southern Construction Engineers was headed by his grandfather, George Youngberg. I don't know any of the principals in the Black, McKinney, and Stewart engineers who came a little bit later to do things. It's really hard to imagine how much happened within 2 years, 3 years at most for it. And the fact that most of it still exists, I find absolutely remarkable. This is a plat of the Gulf View section. You notice the curved to linear streets. This is the south section. This is the downtown area. And this is the area, basically, I think that ends just before the intercoastal. This contains quite a few different types of zoning, so to speak. And this is, since I live on the island of Venice, basically I live in the blank spot here. And people have asked me, why didn't they go over here? Well, basically, the property known generally as Stone Grove originally was owned by Joseph Lord, and he built his house on this property, and they did not. The Stone Associates did not sell their property to the BLE. They kept it as a citrus grove well into the 1950s. Kind of interesting. I know a lot of tidbits. Basically, we've got some photos here of the boulevards, Harbor Drive, West Venice Avenue. This is looking west, and this is another version of it. This is, what am I looking at? Oh, Park Boulevard. I should recognize it. Some of these photos are a little old, I'll admit to that. Most of these palm trees are gone, thank goodness. This is an intersection of Park Boulevard with Granada and Castile. And then this is a picture of the Tamiami Trail. What's interesting about this is all of these roads that we talked about in this particular slide still exist in the original size that Nolen had established. Now you're going to ask, why do I throw in black and white photos? There's a good explanation for that. When we started the nomination for the National Register, the federal government was requiring black and white photos and trying to find, this was, at a time when black and white film was very difficult to come by, and getting someone to process it as black and white film was even more challenging. We made a couple trips to Sarasota to a company that no longer exists that actually did it for us. We went through so many different iterations of the plan that by the time we did the final one, the federal government was accepting colored digital images for the plan. Yes, by the way, all the photos we took over, all the different variations are available for viewing at the Venice Archives, if you're really interested. Now, this is some of the parks within within the Gulfview section. This is John Nolen Park, which is just south of the Lord Heigl House. This is an aerial view of Prentice French Park, which is only a couple blocks from where I live. And the green highlighted items are obviously here and there. And this particular outlined in pink is at the intersection of two streets. Kind of an interesting, almost mini park, so to speak. The city actually put a light in it. There's a couple trees. Very nice little area. What's even more interesting is in the middle of certain of these big residential blocks, there is an open area. City opted to I call them mid-block parks because they're literally in the middle of a block. All of them are. And the city calls them pocket parks. I guess I just wasn't forceful enough in coming up with a name for it. Again, you can see the difference between the different ones. This is part of the Civic Center. This area in here contains the recreational facilities, and this to the right or south of Venice Avenue is the City Hall complex, which is visible here in this photo. And then you look the other way, you see the recreational facilities, shuffleboard courts. I don't know how I could have forgotten about them. And here's the playground equipment. Again, these aren't particularly new photos, but these recreational facilities still exist in the area. And this is a little bit better version of City Hall. The hardest problem with taking pictures of some of this area was making sure there wasn't any extraneous cars or people in it, which it doesn't sound like it's a big problem, but if you try to do it during season, Now this is, again, in the Gulfview section. This is the commercial area. This is the 200 block of Venice Avenue. And what you're really going to notice from this is the fact that all of these palm trees are now gone. They died of disease, and there's new landscaping in it. Basically, the National Register nomination highlights what the city looked like in 2010. And this is just another view of the 300 block of Venice Avenue. Again, the black and white ones were some of the initial images we did. Venice Avenue at Nokomis Avenue, the very first building constructed in Venice, the Venice Hotel on North Nassau Street, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the San Marco Hotel, which is more commonly known as the KMI building, because this was occupied by them at the time. Yes, we're still talking about the Gulfview section. These are some additional residential areas. This area here, these are the houses. The only thing, in my opinion, that classifies as mansions from the 1920 era, the owner of this house has recently died. And the other thing we need to talk about is this area here, which is commonly known as the apartment district. Most people don't realize that there Armada Avenue and Menendez, I believe, all were lined with 8-unit apartment buildings. And all of these apartment buildings were around a park. This is a very European way of looking at things. And because if you've ever been to Europe, you see the big apartment buildings and they all face a park. New York City Central Park is obviously a good example, although a little bit bigger than what we have in Venice. But there were, besides the Mediterranean Revival structures, there are other houses, ranch houses such as this one. This is a ranch house done in kind of a faux Mediterranean Revival style. This particular house here is normally referred to as mid-century, well, not so much mid-century, as modern. I do have to admit that if you go look at this house, it's been Mediterranean Revival. It has been changed to conform to the Architectural Review Board's idea of what houses in Venice should be. Actually, I thought this was kind of a neat house before it was modified, but personal opinion. We'll move on now to the other major subdivision that was platted, Venezia Park. Venezia Park was intended for higher-end residential areas. And I was speaking with John Watson today, and it's kind of interesting, if anyone's interested. The Archives building is in the Gulfview section, and the museum is in the Venezia Park subdivision, because this is the line that divides them. A little bit of trivia, doesn't really, and again, we talk about the streets, the boulevards, the idea of a very landscaped, tree-lined area. And these are the parks within Venezia Park. This is Blaylock Park, West Blaylock Park, an aerial view, and this is Venezia Park here. Again, identified by in those two areas on the plan. This is a ground view of West Blaylock Park. Again, this was taken before it became the Arboretum, so there's not as many trees in this image as there was. And again, this is a view from Verona looking into the park. So there's always, Nolen was always conscious of when you turned on a street that you saw something unique, that you saw something green, basically. And this park here is basically at the intersection of South Nassau Street and Pensacola. It's just a green space, and it modified here by the dot that's up there. Every time streets met at kind of an odd angle, they're public property, and the city maintains them as parks. Okay, this is Venezia Park. Yes, there are Mediterranean Revival buildings in the area. This one is on Sorrento Street, and in my opinion, probably has the best addition that was ever made to one of the original houses. This is Harbor Drive, and there's a whole series of them. What you see is that later development didn't conform to the Mediterranean Revival or Northern Italian Renaissance, if you will. And again, here's another within the Venezia Park of a more modern structure. It still exists. The third basic area we need to talk about is the Edgewood section that is east of the intercoastal, and most of it is east of what we now call the bypass. This is kind of an interesting one to talk about, because Nolen specified that this road here, which we now know as the Venice, which was then known as the Venice Byway, and we know as the Venice Bypass, he stated that this street should be at least 100 feet wide, because he envisioned that this would be a major road going south to Englewood. Well, the Brotherhood didn't think that was such a good idea, and so they asked him to narrow the road. And the plan was modified to narrow it. The interesting thing is that when the bypass was widened, it was widened to 140 feet. They took back all the original, they increased it even beyond what Nolen had speculated that it should be. Let's see. Edgewood consisted, what's interesting, you'll notice, first of all, there doesn't appear to be a park in this subdivision. Well, basically, this is Hatchet Creek, the original location of Hatchet Creek, and Nolen always wanted or specified that any waterway would have green spaces on either side. There wasn't to be any houses or anything of that nature. The city, in their wisdom, forgot the year, basically took Hatchet Creek and did this to it. Made it a right angle turn. So this got completely eliminated from things. What was interesting is when I was the director of historical resources, the city's engineering department was doing some work in the area to extend water and sewer lines, and they couldn't figure out why the ground seemed so kind of different than in other places, and I had to explain to them that it used to be the bottom of a creek. This is the Country Club Estates, a little bit smaller boulevard, and the one park that is in the area today was actually on lots donated by the Mundy family. She served on city council at one time. So a little bit later, not exactly part of the plan, but Edgewood did get their park. And it has ball fields and a very nice little park. Okay, speaking of Edgewood, this aerial view, this is Venice Avenue, and this is the byway. You were out in the middle of nowhere, basically, if you lived in Edgewood in the 1920s. The interesting thing is that while this wasn't specifically designed for BLE retirees, many of them did come, and basically they requested areas that didn't cost as much, and that the lots were smaller so that people could afford them. This is basically Groveland and Myrtle Streets. And this image here is of some of the houses that were built on Groveland. As you can see, this is a 1920s house here, and so is this one. They weren't as strict about the look or the architectural design of houses in Edgewood. And this is another view of a street that clearly shows that there was a lot of latitude given to people who built houses in this area because it was for people that weren't rich, basically. I don't know how else to describe it. This is a very interesting house from 1954 in the modern style. And you see a number of houses that look similar to this throughout the city. This particular building is on Laurel Avenue. Okay, why would I bother showing this one? It's a pink ranch, big deal. Basically, this is a poured concrete house, a panelized concrete house. They basically built the panels for all the sections of the house and assembled them on site. It's a little difficult to see in here, but you'll notice it has kind of an unusual footing. It stands out from it. You basically had a footing, and the panels were then inserted into that footing. This is just one of the many styles of houses in this, and the only reason I point this out is not everything that is historic in nature is in the Mediterranean Revival style of architecture. And this is kind of a personal beef I have with the Architecture Review Board. And this, believe it or not, is the actual plan for the district that was submitted and actually got accepted to it. And if you've noticed around town, there are these very interesting signs that indicate which streets are part of the plan. And for those of you that are interested, and many of you have already purchased this book, this is the book that I wrote after the nomination was accepted, because I felt that the information contained in it needed to have a wider audience. And this book is available at the Venice Museum and Archives. And if you find any errors in it, I guess you can blame me. That's kind of concludes this program. But I'll be happy to entertain any questions that someone might have. And I suppose the easiest way to do that is to go to the front. Okay, and no one has any question? Oh, Bill Jervy.
Yeah, Dorothy, one thing that has always intrigued me is you mentioned that the John Nolen's documents and so forth are at Cornell.
That's correct.
When you and Phil went there doing your research, did you inquire as to why he left them to Cornell? As far as I know, he had no other direct contact or interest in
Well, Cornell, as part of their mission, is to collect the papers of all city planners. And I'm pretty sure that they approached the family after he died. I don't know the exact date on which it was, but Nolen did hundreds of plans throughout the United States. And it's an extensive collection, and I believe the museum actually has a complete finding aids for everything that's there. The only thing interesting about that, and Phil, my husband, keeps telling everybody, basically I disappeared 4 floors below ground when I went into the library, because that's where the archives were located at Cornell, and which is, for those of you that don't really have never been to Cornell, upstate New York, there's a lot of rock there, so it's almost bomb-proof where they keep their archives. And not everything is on the site of the undergraduate library there. Magnificent library, beautiful campus, you ever get a chance to go. But, you know, be prepared to walk uphill or down.
Any other questions?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I'm curious about Edgewood because I have possibly been misled that Edgewood, oh, I talk loud enough. Edgewood, I thought was built first.
No.
No.
No, basically, they started building basically the commercial area downtown and basically Venezia Park. You know, we're talking months, you know, not years when we're talking about who came first, you know. It's interesting to note that originally the city charter did not include Edgewood. And the people that lived in Edgewood actually requested that they become part of the city of Venice. And they succeeded. And the city accepted them, yeah.
We're trying to keep them that way. Thank you.
You're welcome. Betty?
Dorothy, the Planning Commission does not want to recognize that Edgewood is a historic district.
Well, it was listed in the National Register of Historic Places before the plan was. And this goes back to the late 1980s and everything. People get kind of strange ideas in their head that if it's not upscale and it's not Mediterranean revival, it can't possibly be important. And I do remember when Edgewood was put, district, this is before the plan, was put on the National Register. People who lived in the area were very pleased. Because they knew their area was important, that they knew it was important, and they wanted everyone to recognize it. Yes, the houses are much smaller. Many of them are just wood frame. But it's a community, and the infill has been in the same scale, size of houses, et cetera, for it. Yeah. I don't know why people get these ideas. It kind of, I don't quite understand why a lot of people on the Planning Commission don't understand that their job is to protect the Nolen plant, to protect what was platted in the 1920s, and to see that infill construction is in proportion to what was already there. You know, you're not creating, you know, mega houses, et cetera. Personal opinion, I gotta keep putting that in.
Very good.
And I hope this is not the last you hear of Edgewood, because we're trying to move that to the top of the consciousness of the city council. The Planning Commission, in its wisdom, in its LDRs, its proposed land development regulations, has denied to the city any opportunity to create a new historic district. Now, just to be clear, we have several historic districts in Venice, including Edgewood Historic District, but it is not protected at all. The sign says it's a historic district, but it has no protection without further action by the city council to establish an ordinance that protects it from demolition. Right now, there is no protection for Edgewood. Right now, the Planning Commission has said no more historic districts, meaning the city council couldn't create a historic district for Edgewood, meaning it wouldn't be protected at all. And if you've been by there, there are houses being knocked down and infill houses put in their place. So we're trying to move this to the top of the agenda for the city council so that the city council understands and the citizens understand that Edgewood and other places are not protected unless they're within a city designated historic district. And right now we have only two. That is the historic Venice district, architectural control district, controlled by the ARB, and also the Venice theme district, also controlled by the ARB.
I should point out that the theme district refers just to commercial infill. It's not even protecting houses within the theme district. And many of the most prominent houses, both from the 20s and later eras, are not within the ARB's historic district. My personal opinion is, and you'll be the first to hear it in public, that the city's Historic Preservation Board should have control over what is now referred to as the ARB Historic District, because the ARB doesn't really understand that historic structures have to be reviewed differently than new construction, and they're all into new construction.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I joined the Historic Preservation Board, appointed to the board in 2015. Since that time to the moment, we have proposed that the Historic Preservation Board had jurisdiction over the historic houses in Venetian Theme District and the Venice Historic District. And to date, that has not been adopted by the city, and it's not likely to be either. So we're fighting the fight. We ask you to join in the fight and help us save historic Venice and particularly Edgewood. I think that's particularly vulnerable at the moment. That's enough commercials, so unless there's something else for Dorothy, I'm going to call the meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming.
Golf and River Club.